Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world of powdered pigments, perfectly sculpted marble torsos, and artists so temperamental they'd probably walk out of an argument with a loaf of bread if it looked at them funny. You're about to stroll through the cobbled streets of Florence during the Renaissance, that fragrant, flamboyant moment in history when art wasn't just life. So it was a full contact sport. And let's be honest, you wouldn't survive 5 minutes. Between the flying insults, the fresco-related drama, and the bitter fights over whose Madonna had the softest jawline, your modern-day patience, and maybe your ego, would crumble faster than a poorly primed canvas in humidity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your current time and location. Let's see where in the world people are falling asleep to dramatic art feuds. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your walk just before dusk, the kind of golden haze that makes even damp laundry look like divine drapery. The air smells like warm plaster, dry basil, and somewhere in the distance, burnt bread. It's Florence around 1480, and you're about to enter the belly of beauty, and egos the size of cathedral domes. You pass by a plaza where two apprentices are arguing over whether their master prefers lapis lazuli crushed with honey or goat bile. You pretend not to listen, but of course you do. This is Florence. Secrets here are as rare as a humble sculptor. To your left, a man in a velvet cap dramatically rips up a sketch. His drawing of a cherub apparently smiles like a merchant. That's an insult here, in case you were wondering. You duck into a quieter alley where the shadows are soft and cool. The bricks sweat slightly under the weight of centuries. You can almost hear the echo of past footsteps, poets, painters, papal spies. You emerge into the Piazza della Signoria. Towering above, the Palazzo Vecchio stands like an oversized filing cabinet of Florentine grudges. You imagine the heated debates behind its thick walls. Should a saint's robe be lavender or lilac? Does Jesus look better in profile? Then, near a small trattoria, you hear the first mention of a name that will follow you like a stray cat through this entire journey: Leonardo. A group of students whisper about his new invention, some winged thing made of parchment and pure madness. Someone scoffs, "He can't even finish a painting." You'll hear that phrase again, many times, but for now you linger by a window glowing from within. The warm light spills across the cobblestones like egg yolk. Inside, an artist is bent over a panel, muttering to himself in what sounds like Latin, but might just be very fancy Italian cursing. He dips his brush, hesitates, then starts over. Again. The scene is oddly soothing. A man at war with perfection, night after night, chasing a face that may never smile back quite the way he wants it to. As you walk on, you begin to notice something funny about the city. Every block hums with rivalry. There are frescoes painted too high so no one else can fix them. Studios facing opposite directions, just so one artist doesn't have to look at another's door. You pause near a bakery where two painters are sketching loaves. One claims his has better shadow work. The other throws flour, and then it hits you. Florence in the Renaissance isn't just the cradle of modern art. It's a mildly dysfunctional artist commune with great lighting. The colors are bold, the people bolder. The arguments absolutely ridiculous. You're not even surprised when someone complains about how the angel's knees look too democratic. Later you stop at the edge of the Arno River. The water reflects the last blush of daylight like a canvas being rinsed. In the distance someone is singing, off-key, probably intentionally. That's the kind of mood the city's in. A soft breeze carries the scent of olive oil and rivalry. You breathe it in. There's peace in the absurdity, in the way these artists bicker and belittle each other, yet build a legacy that will outlive them by centuries. You settle on a stone bench, watching as a group of students walk past, laughing about a rumor that Botticelli once rejected a painting commission because the client wanted the Virgin Mary to wear shoes. You smile, and as the sky deepens, you realize in this city of divine ceilings and cracked tempera, the real masterpieces might just be the arguments they left behind. But the most legendary one, that begins tomorrow, between two names you've heard before, and they're about to throw paint and words like daggers. You've barely gotten used to the sound of your own footsteps echoing down the alleyways of Florence when you hear the rumble of something much louder. Not thunder, not drums, but two egos colliding somewhere between a statue and a snide. Remark you turn a corner and, like stumbling into a myth made flesh, there they are, Leonardo, Michelangelo. Not exactly standing shoulder to shoulder. More like glaring at each other across the open space of the Piazza della Signoria, as if the very air between them had picked a side. Leonardo, older, elegant, his beard like a cascade of calculated thought. Always in velvet, always with a notebook, tucked under his arm like it contained the secrets of the universe, which honestly it might. And Michelangelo, brooding, impatient, muscles like coiled rope under his tunic, eyes that looked at marble the way a hungry man looks at bread. Except Michelangelo's idea of bread is a 14-foot-tall biblical hero with perfectly articulated toes. You hide behind a potted olive tree. No need to get in the crossfire. Apparently, the current dispute started with an unfinished wall. Because, of course it did. The city had the brilliant idea of commissioning both Leonardo and Michelangelo to paint giant murals on opposite sides of the same room, in the same hall, at the same time. What could possibly go wrong? Leonardo chose the Battle of Anghiari, swirling horses, snarling faces, the kind of chaos that looked like a symphony of madness. He even invented a new way of painting with wax and heat. Spoiler, it melted, literally, right off the wall. Michelangelo? He went with the Battle of Cassina, men bathing, then suddenly ambushed, muscles everywhere, limbs twisting. It looked like a wrestling match broke out at a Roman bathhouse. Historians still debate whether he was painting soldiers or just flexing. At one point, you overhear Leonardo say, with that silky, dismissive tone, "Your men look like sacks of walnuts." To which Michelangelo spits back, "At least mine don't." Ride horses like limp eels, you chuckle, quietly. One day, Michelangelo passed Leonardo on the street while surrounded by fans and students. A man asked Leonardo to explain a passage from Dante. Leonardo, ever the diplomat, said, "Why not ask Michelangelo? He knows everything." Oh no, that wasn't a compliment. That was an artfully disguised jab, dipped in ink and served with a side of salt. Michelangelo's response, something along the lines of stomping away while shouting, "Do your paintings even dry properly?" There's a very real chance these two geniuses would have fought to the death if not for one thing. Neither of them had the time, or the social stamina. Leonardo was too busy trying to make flying machines out of bat wings. Michelangelo? He was halfway into carving a tomb he didn't even want to finish. They didn't have time for duels, just really mean glances across piazzas, and yet oddly, they were obsessed with each other. Leonardo once dissected over 30 human corpses to study anatomy. Michelangelo? He just stared at his own reflection, probably flexed, and went back to chiseling. Leonardo wrote treatises. Michelangelo wrote poetry, usually angry ones about how much he hated being famous. You think about this as you walk under the colonnades. There's something comforting about their ridiculous rivalry, like watching two cats hiss over the same sunbeam. Except one cat is inventing scuba gear, and the other's carving Moses with glowing knees. Historians still argue today about which of them was greater, but they miss the point. The point is that Renaissance art wouldn't have been the same without their mutual disdain. It sharpened them, like rival knives pressed against each other. One painted ceilings, one painted very little, but imagined everything. And somewhere in between, in the tension and the tantrums, a golden age was born. You pause by the Arno again. The river moves slowly tonight. Like it too is tired of carrying gossip. You think if these two had just talked it out over wine, we might have gotten a mural so epic the building couldn't hold it. But then again, that wouldn't be very Renaissance, would it? And just when you think it can't get any sillier than this feud, someone behind you whispers about another argument, this time involving two versions of David, a missing nose, and a statue that was almost thrown off a roof. Of course, welcome to Florence. You've barely gotten used to the sound of your own footsteps echoing down the alleyways of Florence when you hear the rumble of something much louder, not thunder, not drums, but two egos colliding somewhere between a statue and a snide remark. You turn a corner and, like stumbling into a myth-made flesh, there they are. Leonardo, Michelangelo. Not exactly standing shoulder to shoulder, more like glaring at each other across the open space of the Piazza della Signoria, as if the very air between them had picked a side. Leonardo, older, elegant, his beard like a cascade of calculated thought. Always in velvet, always with a notebook, tucked under his arm like it contained the secrets of the universe, which honestly it might. And Michelangelo, brooding, impatient, muscles like coiled rope under his tunic, eyes that looked at marble the way a hungry man looks at bread. Except Michelangelo's idea of bread is a 14-foot-tall biblical hero with perfectly articulated toes. You hide behind a potted olive tree. No need to get in the crossfire. Apparently, the current dispute started with an unfinished wall. Because, of course it did. The city had the brilliant idea of commissioning both Leonardo and Michelangelo to paint giant murals on opposite sides of the same room, in the same hall, at the same time. What could possibly go wrong? Leonardo chose the Battle of Anghiari, swirling horses, snarling faces, the kind of chaos that looked like a symphony of madness. He even invented a new way of painting with wax and heat. Spoiler, it melted, literally, right off the wall. Michelangelo? He went with the Battle of Cassina, men bathing, then suddenly ambushed, muscles everywhere, limbs twisting. It looked like a wrestling match broke out at a Roman bathhouse. Historians still debate whether he was painting soldiers or just flexing. At one point, you overhear Leonardo say, with that silky, dismissive tone, "Your men look like sacks of walnuts." To which Michelangelo spits back, "At least mine don't." Ride horses like limp eels, you chuckle, quietly. One day, Michelangelo passed Leonardo on the street while surrounded by fans and students. A man asked Leonardo to explain a passage from Dante. Leonardo, ever the diplomat, said, "Why not ask Michelangelo? He knows everything." Oh no, that wasn't a compliment. That was an artfully disguised jab, dipped in ink and served with a side of salt. Michelangelo's response, something along the lines of stomping away while shouting, "Do your paintings even dry properly?" There's a very real chance these two geniuses would have fought to the death if not for one thing. Neither of them had the time, or the social stamina. Leonardo was too busy trying to make flying machines out of bat wings. Michelangelo? He was halfway into carving a tomb he didn't even want to finish. They didn't have time for duels, just really mean glances across piazzas, and yet oddly, they were obsessed with each other. Leonardo once dissected over 30 human corpses to study anatomy. Michelangelo? He just stared at his own reflection, probably flexed, and went back to chiseling. Leonardo wrote treatises. Michelangelo wrote poetry, usually angry ones about how much he hated being famous. You think about this as you walk under the colonnades. There's something comforting about their ridiculous rivalry, like watching two cats hiss over the same sunbeam. Except one cat is inventing scuba gear, and the other's carving Moses with glowing knees. Historians still argue today about which of them was greater, but they miss the point. The point is that Renaissance art wouldn't have been the same without their mutual disdain. It sharpened them, like rival knives pressed against each other. One painted ceilings, one painted very little, but imagined everything. And somewhere in between, in the tension and the tantrums, a golden age was born. You pause by the Arno again. The river moves slowly tonight. Like it too is tired of carrying gossip. You think if these two had just talked it out over wine, we might have gotten a mural so epic the building couldn't hold it. But then again, that wouldn't be very Renaissance, would it? And just when you think it can't get any sillier than this feud, someone behind you whispers about another argument, this time involving two versions of David, a missing nose, and a statue that was almost thrown off a roof. Of course, welcome to Florence. You follow the murmurs through a twisting lane, and they lead you, unsurprisingly, to a statue. Not just any statue, though. The statue. David. He stands there in all his marble glory, like a man who just won an argument and decided to stay frozen in that moment forever. But here's the thing. There isn't just one David in Florence. No, no. That would be far too reasonable for the Renaissance. There are at least 4, depending on how you count, and each one sparked enough artistic drama to fill a season of reality television. You sit on a low wall in the shadow of Michelangelo's David, the most famous of them all. 17 feet of divine defiance, muscles so taut they might snap if the pigeon on his shoulder coos too loud. But tonight's story starts with someone else, Donatello. Donatello's David came first, a lean, strange figure wearing nothing but a floppy hat and a smirk. He looks less like a hero and more like a teen who just got away with stealing grapes from the market, and he's stepping triumphantly on Goliath's head with an expression that says, "I don't even need shoes for this." When it was unveiled, Florence politely applauded, then quietly gasped, then whispered for decades, because Donatello's David, well, was a little too relaxed. Some called it sensual, others called it scandalous. Michelangelo called it an interesting choice, which from him was basically a slap. Fast forward a few decades. Florence, ever the drama queen of city-states, decided they wanted a new David, one that was big, bold, unapologetically intimidating. Enter Michelangelo, fresh off a long sulk about ceiling commissions and unfinished tombs. He was handed a massive, ruined block of marble, already partially carved and nearly abandoned by 2 other sculptors. He looked at it and said basically, "Challenge accepted." For nearly 2 years he worked in secrecy. People said they could hear marble being struck at odd hours. Someone swore they saw Michelangelo arguing with the stone itself. A baker said he caught him whispering, "You will give me a decent knee, you stubborn lump." When the David was finally revealed, Florence went silent, then loud, then confused. Because Michelangelo's David? Not only was he nude, again, this is Florence, but he was also furious. His brow furrowed, veins bulging, eyes locked on an enemy that didn't exist except in his mind. People debated everything. His stance, his hands, the size of his slingshot. But most of all, they debated where to put him. He was too large to go on the cathedral as originally planned. Some suggested outside City Hall, others worried he'd be too exposed. One guy suggested maybe a corner near some bushes. The final decision, right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, the literal heart of Florentine politics. A message, loud and clear: we are David, and don't mess with us, except the statue wasn't carved with any modesty protection. So not long after installation, someone made a fig leaf. Art historians still argue about who commissioned it. Some say it was a cardinal with an unusually shy nephew. Others blame a council of decency. Michelangelo probably rolled his eyes so hard he saw the back of the Renaissance. Now here's the juicy part. Donatello's supporters weren't thrilled. They claimed his David had more nuance, more subtlety, more hat. A rumor spread that Michelangelo once muttered, "At least my David doesn't look like he's auditioning for a masquerade," to which someone else supposedly replied, "Yours looks like he needs a snack." And in this chaos, the lesser-known Verrocchio entered the chat. His David, short, proud, slightly pouty, holding Goliath's head like it might still be breathing. No one asked for a third David, but Florence is the kind of city where someone hears, "That's enough Davids," and thinks, "Better make one. More." You lean back, watching moonlight catch the chisel marks that still whisper across Michelangelo's masterpiece. There's something absurdly beautiful about it all. The fact that 4 grown men across different decades all looked at the same Bible story and thought, "You know what this needs? More drama." And behind every David, a mountain of petty notes, jealous whispers, and studio assistants running for espresso while trying to dodge flying mallets. Historians still argue about which David is truest to the spirit of the original tale. But maybe, just maybe, the Renaissance didn't care about truth. It cared about interpretation, about carving your opinion into stone so firmly that people 500 years later still debate your artistic choices over brunch. You yawn, leaning your head against the cool wall somewhere. A cat meows like it has thoughts about Donatello's proportions. And as your eyes start to close, you hear another snippet of conversation drifting from the studio window nearby. Apparently, Raphael just entered the story, and he's Causing problems because someone said he's too handsome to be a real artist, of course. Here we go again. You wake to the sound of soft laughter, footsteps clicking over marble, and the unmistakable hum of people whispering about cheekbones. Raphael has arrived, not with a thunderclap like Michelangelo or a philosophical storm like Leonardo. No, Raphael enters the Renaissance like a breeze carrying the scent of fresh paint and cologne that probably cost a week's rent. You don't see him at first, you sense him. The way flowers seem to lean towards sunlight, the way mirrors in Florence seem to polish themselves, and then there he is, standing under an archway, sketchbook in one hand, a curl of hair escaping beneath a velvet cap that definitely wasn't bought. At the discount corner of the marketplace. Let's be honest, Raphael was the Renaissance's version of that guy who shows up to a group project, does one part flawlessly, flirts with the professor, and gets invited to dinner by the dean. But the thing is, you can't even hate him for it, because Raphael wasn't just charming, he was ridiculously talented. His brushwork was so smooth that even other artists, sworn to eternal pettiness, would pause mid-insult and mumble something about decent use of light. You overhear two assistants murmuring near a stairwell. "Did you see the Madonna he painted yesterday? Her eyes actually made my mother cry." The other one nods solemnly. "Mine tried to adopt her." But with great beauty comes great drama, especially when your face becomes the subject of Renaissance speculation. Rumors swirl that Raphael spends hours in front of the mirror, studying light, that he changes tunics midday for color harmony, that he once delayed a painting because he couldn't decide if his curls were having a symmetrical moment. And yet, behind the looks, there was real brilliance. You peek into a chapel where his frescoes glow like golden lullabies. His Madonnas don't just look holy, they look like they understand your deepest insecurities and would offer you soup. Even Michelangelo, when pressed, very, very hard, once admitted Raphael had a decent hand. Of course, he followed that by saying, "Too bad it's attached to a man who wears scented gloves." Still, the rivalry was real. When Raphael was commissioned to paint the Stanza della Segnatura, a whole room in the Vatican, he decorated it with philosophers, all the greats, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and with a quiet smirk he painted Leonardo's face as Plato. It was either flattery or the Renaissance version of subtweeting. No one's sure. Later, someone claims Michelangelo snuck into the chapel at night and painted a pigeon on the ceiling. It's probably not true, but the story lives. Even Raphael's funeral was suspiciously perfect. He died young, 37, and people wept like the city had lost its favorite son and hairstylist in one. Historians still debate the cause of his death. Some say fever, some say overwork. One writer suggested, with no real evidence but lots of flair, that he died from too much passion, probably while wearing a silk robe. You sit on the steps near one of his frescoes and just watch. The colors breathe, the lines soothe. The characters look like they could lean out of the painting and offer life advice. And for a moment, you forget the rivalries, the jealousy, the gossip. You remember that sometimes the prettiest person in the room also knows exactly what they're doing with a brush. Then someone walks past you muttering, "At least Raphael didn't steal his red pigment like Titian." Oh, that sounds like another artist with a complicated relationship to color and pigment and possibly honesty. Your nights, just getting started. You step away from Raphael's lingering glow and into a quieter corridor, less velvet, more parchment. The light shifts too, from soft golden brush strokes to the flickering ink of handwritten drama. This is where you meet Giorgio Vasari. Now, you might not have heard of him as often as Leonardo, Michelangelo, or that guy who made Mary look like your favorite aunt. But Vasari, he's the reason you've heard of any of them at all. He was a painter, an architect, a competent one. But what he really was the Renaissance's most dramatic biographer. You hear the scratch of a quill before you see him. Behind a cracked door, Vasari sits hunched over a cluttered desk, illuminated by a single oil lamp. There are ink stains on his cuffs and a smirk barely hiding behind his beard. He's not painting, he's writing. furiously. And in that moment, it clicks. While the others immortalized saints, angels, and ancient heroes, Vasari immortalized them. His book, Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, was the 16th century version of an artist roast session crossed with a love letter and spiced with a generous helping of Renaissance gossip. You lean closer. On one page, he praises Giotto for reviving true art. On the next, he claims another artist died of gluttony and left behind nothing but unfinished sketches and poor hygiene. He calls Leonardo divinely gifted, but also lazy. He says Michelangelo is unmatched, but also temperamental. He accuses lesser-known painters of soul decay and picking color schemes like blind monks. The thing is, half of what he writes might be true, the other half. Pure, unfiltered Renaissance shade. You hear him mutter, Should I mention that Titian made his apprentices mix paint for 10 years before letting them draw a toe? Yes, footnote it. It's almost impressive how casually he throws artistic reputations under gilded wagons. And yet, artists kept talking to him. They invited him to dinner. They offered interviews, posed for portraits, showed him their drafts, because in the end, they wanted to be remembered. Even if remembered by Vasari meant being described as charming but shaped heads like misshapen. Pears, you step back into the hall and look up. Vasari didn't just write about buildings. He designed them too. He helped plan the Uffizi Gallery. He painted ceilings, he restored chapels, and he always found a way to mention himself. There's even a passage where he praises his own ceiling work, then adds, "I would have done better had I been less rushed." Right. He also invented the idea that the Renaissance had periods, an early, high, late, basically naming the movements the same way a wine snob talks about grapes. It stuck. Historians still argue about how much of his book is fact, how much is fiction, and how much is Vasari just having fun. And honestly, that's the magic, because through Vasari's words, the Renaissance lives not as a museum exhibit, but as a chaotic dinner party of brilliant, backstabbing artists trying to outdo each other in pigment and poetry. You pass a shelf filled with old volumes. One is open to the section on a painter who once fought a goose over a pear tart, then painted the scene and sold it for 6 florins. Of course, you can't verify it, but you want it to be true. As the candlelight flickers, you smile. Somewhere down the hall, someone mentions Titian again. And this time, they're talking about his obsession with the color red. Apparently, there's a scandal involving stolen pigments, a jealous apprentice, and a sunset that caused a 3-day argument. You rise from your seat, curiosity pulling you forward like a thread, because in Renaissance Italy, even colors had drama. You follow the scent of oil and varnish down a narrow hallway until the shadows begin to warm, not from the sun, but from the memory of a color so rich, so infamous, it nearly deserves its own chapter in every art history book. The color, red, and the man who practically weaponized it. Titian. You first see him hunched over a canvas near a window, late afternoon light sliding across his workshop like melted amber. His robes are flecked with dried paint, burnt sienna, blood crimson, a bit of gold dust that's somehow also in his beard. He's muttering something about, "This red isn't angry enough, you don't interrupt, you just watch." Because Titian wasn't painting, he was orchestrating. Every brushstroke felt like a bold musical note in a symphony of passion, decay, empire, and ecclesiastical flair. And at the center of it all, that red. A deep, smoldering red he used for robes, for shadows, for lips that had secrets. But here's the thing they don't always tell you. Red during the Renaissance wasn't easy to come by. The pigment came from crushed insects, cochineal, imported at outrageous prices from the New World, or vermilion made from mercury and sulfur. Both dangerous, both hard to store, and both highly stealable, and steal they did. There's a whispered story about one of Titian's apprentices, let's call him Marco the Ambitious, who once tried to take a sealed vial of red home for practice. The next day, Marco was mysteriously transferred to permanent floor sweeping. Another tale claims Titian kept his reds locked in a cabinet with 3 keys, one for him, one for his oldest assistant, and one hidden in the handle of a paintbrush. A bit much? Yes, but when you see the results, you get it. His paintings glowed from across the room, not with the shine of gold, but with the warmth of life, the kind of warmth you feel when someone stares at you a little too long, a little too knowingly. And people noticed. Popes, princes, poets. They begged for Titian portraits, not just because he captured their likeness, but because he painted them like legends, soaked in that signature red that made them look like gods on the verge of scandal. Other artists grew jealous, of course. You overhear two of them arguing near a marketplace. "Stall, it's just red. It's Titian red. It's overpriced bug juice. It's passion-made pigment." Back in the studio, Titian adds a final stroke to the corner of a painting. The canvas glows. It actually glows. And here's the wild part. Titian never gave away his formula. Not to students, not to friends, not even to his son, who inherited his brushes but not the magic. Art historians still argue about what exact mix he used. Some swear by Madder Lake with a saffron binder. Others say it was all in the layering. Applied so slowly you'd think the canvas was aging like wine. Whatever the case, Titian guarded his reds like gold. And maybe that's what made them so powerful. You lean in closer to one of his works. A cardinal's robe ripples like it's breathing. A woman's lips shimmer like they've just spoken something you're not allowed to hear. Even now, centuries later, the color seems wet, alive. There's a moment of stillness. You're almost lulled to sleep by the warmth of the scene, the hush of the brushwork. Then from the back room you hear a furious voice yell, "This isn't red, this is orange with attitude." You stifle a laugh. Seems like even within his own studio the drama of the palette continues. But your journey isn't over yet. Because while Titian was painting with fire, others were arguing about the canvas itself. Apparently there's a brewing war over which surface is better, the slick, modern appeal of oil-painted canvas, or the ancient, crumbling poetry of fresco on plaster. And of course, neither side intends to compromise. You step into a studio that smells sharply of lime and smoke, not the kind of cozy studio Titian would have lounged in, sipping wine and admiring his own sleeve folds. No, this place feels urgent, like something's about to collapse, or explode, or be debated into oblivion. There are two artists in the middle of the room, surrounded by walls in various stages of chaos. One is up on scaffolding, muttering to himself in rhythm with his brush. Wet plaster, dry panic, breathe, paint. Blend, oh no, too late. The other lounges by a canvas on an easel, feet crossed, palette in hand, sipping something suspiciously luxurious from a pewter cup. You've walked straight into the most passionate and unnecessary artistic divorce of the Renaissance, fresco versus oil painting. To your left, the fresco purist. Drenched in plaster dust, shirt permanently stained a pale grey. He believes that true art must be done quickly, with paint on wet plaster, before it dries. Once it sets, it's eternal. Every mistake, immortal. He points to the wall, a half-finished saint who's inexplicably cross-eyed, and mutters, "That's what happens when lunch takes too long." To your right, the oil advocate, draped in linen that has never met a workbench. He strokes his chin dramatically and says things like, "Art should be allowed to dry when it wants to, like a fine cheese or a difficult friend." You sit between them, half expecting one to throw a brush like a dagger. Fresco artists brag about their discipline, about how their work becomes the wall itself, about how they must paint with lightning reflexes and divine inspiration before the plaster stiffens like a politician avoiding commitment. Oil painters, they brag about nuance, layering, subtlety. "You don't rush a sunset," one says, and "you don't rush shadow beneath the eyelid of a grieving Virgin Mary." Somewhere a third artist walks by holding a tempera board and is immediately ignored. You chuckle to yourself. The fresco guy goes off again, pointing to a massive dome he once worked on. He describes how he lay flat on wooden planks, upside down, elbow deep in wet lime, painting a scene of angels ascending, all while dodging dust, gravity, and soup drips from above. Now that, he says, is devotion. The oil guy yawns, flicks his brush, and reveals a canvas of such velvety depth it practically whispers poetry. "I had time," he says, "to blend, to rethink, to be excellent." The debate has been raging for decades. Leonardo himself once tried to mix both, painting the Last Supper using experimental oil on plaster. Spoiler, it peeled spectacularly. Michelangelo hated oil, called it for amateurs who are afraid of stone. But even he admitted fresco was like painting on melting cheese, if the cheese could yell at you. You wander through the room as the argument rises like heat. One wall is covered in cracked, majestic frescoes, colors a bit faded but still noble. Another is stacked with oil canvases, glossy, deep, luxurious enough to make you want to touch them. Don't. The truth is, both are beautiful, both maddening. But in Renaissance Italy, you couldn't just like both. That would be too diplomatic. No, you had to choose. You notice a fresco of a saint with a hand mysteriously missing. Ran out of time, the artist sighs. Plaster dried. On a canvas nearby, a portrait is unfinished, except the eyes. Painted a week ago, still wet. You swear they blinked. Historians still debate which method defined the Renaissance. But the artists, they debated in paint, in plaster, in passive-aggressive chapel corners. You lean back, feeling the texture of both mediums echoing through your thoughts, and just as your eyelids start to drift, you hear the name Brunelleschi from somewhere down the corridor, followed by the words, "He threw a model at someone. It bounced." The dome guy? The dome and the golden sphere. You sit up, of course. A Renaissance genius with architectural ambitions and no patience for opinions. You're definitely not sleeping yet. The moment you step into the courtyard, the world shifts. Not because of the breeze or the hush of the evening, but because you are now standing beneath one of the most audacious architectural accomplishments of the Renaissance. A feat so improbable, some thought it would collapse before it ever stood. You're under Brunelleschi's dome. It looms above you like a divine riddle solved by stubborn genius. Layers of brick spiraling toward the heavens, held in place by geometry, willpower, and a very, very patient disdain for mediocrity. But let's rewind. Because tonight's story isn't just about architecture, it's about the man behind the dome. And the tiny golden orb that nearly caused an artistic street brawl. Filippo Brunelleschi, clockmaker turned architect, turned not-so-patient perfectionist, was once described as having a mind like a gear, always turning, but sometimes grinding. He didn't ask for respect. He designed it into stone. When Florence announced plans to finally complete the massive gaping hole that was the top of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, dozens of architects submitted their proposals. Some said, "We'll use wooden supports." Others said, "It's impossible." Brunelleschi said, essentially, "Watch me." His solution? A self-supporting dome, built without scaffolding, using an ingenious herringbone brick pattern and custom machines he invented specifically for the project. Machines that frankly scared the horses. He refused to share the full plan with anyone. Not the council, not the builders, not even his own assistant. When asked, he'd say something cryptic like, "You'll understand when you're standing inside it," and honestly, they did. But the dome wasn't just a structure. It became a symbol of Florence's pride. And to top it off, they commissioned a golden orb, the palla, to crown the whole thing. And that, dear listener, is when things got weird. You see, Brunelleschi was obsessed with that orb. He measured it, sketched it, weighed it, redesigned it. At one point, he built a perfect scale model, a glittering, gilded prototype that fit snugly in both palms. Then someone, some poor, unfortunate soul, suggested maybe the orb should be smaller, or that it looked too shiny, or that a weather vane shaped like an angel might be better. Witnesses say Brunelleschi said nothing. He simply picked up the model and hurled it across the meeting room. It hit a wall, bounced, rolled into a scribe's ink pot and stained half a treaty. Brunelleschi stood, smoothed his robes, and left. No one brought it up again. You smile at the memory as you trace your fingers along the base of the dome. Each brick feels like a secret. And though the orb looks tiny from this distance, you know it's the size of a carriage wheel and weighs as much as a scandal. Fun fact, after the orb was finally placed, lightning struck it. Twice some saw it as a bad omen. Others said it was just God expressing admiration very dramatically. Historians still debate the dome's exact engineering. Some call it a mystery. Others say Brunelleschi took certain secrets to his grave out of pettiness. All agree. No one builds like him anymore. You glance up at the orb again. It glints in the moonlight. Arrogant, elegant, utterly unnecessary, and yet perfect. As you turn to leave, you pass a group of students sketching the dome's curve. One says, "It's too symmetrical. I liked Raphael's softness more." You don't stop walking, but you hear a brick shift somewhere in the distance. Probably just the wind, or Brunelleschi rolling in his grave. But before you can think too long about it, your path leads to another familiar tale. A quieter room, a long wooden table, a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and a lot of very tense chairs. Because up next, a supper so legendary it inspired paintings, plays, puzzles, and a truly absurd argument about how many chairs should appear in the scene. Yes, really. You step softly into a long, candle-lit room. The walls are quiet now, but once, this was the site of one of the most fevered artistic disputes in Renaissance memory. Not over theology, not over proportion, not even over who got to be the center of attention. No, it was about chairs, and not just any chairs, the chairs in the Last Supper, that's right. One of the most iconic paintings in human history, and half of Florence was once at each other's throats, trying to decide how many chairs Jesus and his disciples needed, what they should look like, and where exactly the legs should go. You sit on a bench in the far corner of the imagined scene, trying not to laugh as the image takes shape in your mind. At the center, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci, recently recovered from his dome disputes and pigment experiments, now pacing back and forth in front of a wall he's already spent weeks just looking at. Not painting, looking behind him, assistants scurry with sketches. One holds a parchment labeled bread texture options, another carries a platter of assorted fish, reference material, and then, in the middle of this divine composition, the question arises, where do the chairs go? One assistant proposes placing the disciples in formal throne-like seats. To signify holiness, he says. Another argues for rustic benches, more modest. To reflect their humility. Leonardo, famously perfectionist and permanently annoyed, sighs and says something like, "They were reclining in the Greek fashion. There may not have been chairs at all. Cue uproar, you hear it now. Ghostly echoes of artists debating across time. But if there are no chairs, how will Judas push his back from the table in dramatic betrayal? Does Peter need armrests? For gravitas? Is the table floating? Do we paint shadows from the chairs or just imagine them?" Leonardo, to his credit, tried everything. Perspective grids, live models. There's even a rumor that he made 13 apprentices sit at a long table in silence, eating bread for 6 hours straight, just so he could observe elbow positioning. They all quit. The composition of the Last Supper became a puzzle of geometry, gesture, and good table manners. And yes, he eventually included no chairs in the final version. At least not fully visible ones. He went with benches or implied seating, scholars still argue. One claims you can feel the seating. Another wrote an entire dissertation titled "The Silent Stool of Simon." Of course they did. But the arguments didn't stop there. Why is everyone on the same side of the table? Who is holding the salt? Why does Bartholomew look like he's about to launch into a musical number? Leonardo ignored them all. He had bigger concerns, like how to paint tempera and oil onto plaster. Spoiler again, it didn't end well. Or how to show shock, sorrow, and betrayal in a single frame. That part? Masterful. But still, the ghost of those chairs haunted the room for years. Other artists who attempted their own Last Supper scenes leaned hard into furniture. Some gave Jesus a throne. Others put Judas on a stool with 3 uneven legs. One painted a scene where each apostle had a personalized seat with carvings of their faces, like divine high school yearbook chairs. And every time, someone in the background whispered, "Leonardo didn't even bother with chairs." You rest your head against the cool stone wall and close your eyes. It's oddly comforting that this painting, now studied, revered, imitated endlessly, once sparked furious debates over seat placement and wood grain. That even divine moments need furniture. that even miracles get edited for aesthetic. A breeze drifts through the open window, carrying the smell of oil, bread, and old wine. You smile, thinking, if Da Vinci had his way, everyone would be sitting on philosophy, not furniture. And just as you drift, you hear a whisper from the next corridor. They found Botticelli's love letters. There were drawings of shoes. He named them. Of course he did. Florence never sleeps. You enter a smaller chamber now, dimly lit but buzzing with the kind of tension you can only describe as aesthetic rage. The walls are lined with portraits, altarpieces, and mythological scenes, all spectacular, all carefully framed. And yet, none of them seem quite happy with their surroundings. You can feel it. The silent fury of artists who painted Venus with loving care, only to see her trapped in a frame they didn't choose. Welcome to the Renaissance's most underestimated battlefield, the frame wars. That's right. Behind every glorious painting you've ever admired in a museum lies a forgotten chapter of bitter feuds, personal insults, and more than one painter storming out of a church muttering, "Not with that molding, you don't." You sit quietly on a wooden bench as two artists stare daggers across the room at each other. Between them, a stunning depiction of Saint Sebastian, serene, noble, pierced with arrows, and surrounded by a gilded frame shaped like a cabbage. Patch, the painter, fumes. "It ruins the symmetry," he hisses. The framer shrugs. "It's Florentine flourish. It's vegetable heresy." This wasn't a one-time issue. Renaissance artists were notorious for wanting control over color, over pose, over lighting, over theology. So when their perfect compositions were handed to woodworkers to be decorated, things got messy. First, some frames were too ornate, swallowing the painting like a golden kraken. Others were too plain, a peasant's window, as one artist called it. Worse still, the wrong motifs. A frame intended for a painting of the Virgin Mary once arrived with cherubs carved to look like mischievous frogs. That framer was never seen again. Botticelli famously designed his own frames. He believed that each line of wood should echo the brushstrokes within. He once spent more time sketching the frame's corner than painting an angel's face. On the other hand, Titian allegedly once said, "Put it in anything. It's the colors they'll remember." Michelangelo reportedly agreed, but only because he was already halfway back to his marble block. And then there were the patrons, wealthy nobles, bishops, bankers, people who believed that a heavy, elaborate frame proved taste. One Medici heir demanded a frame encrusted with actual pearls. Another ordered a border of 20 carved lions, each with slightly different snarls. The artist quit halfway through. The lions remained. Some churches even reframed paintings without the artist's permission, adding borders of saints who weren't even in the scene. There's a rumor that one painter broke into a chapel at night just to scratch off 2 angels added without his consent. A crime? Yes, also understandable. You walk past a collection of rejected frames. One is shaped like flames, another is made entirely of blackened wood to match the mood of suffering. One has 3 tiny doors for reasons no one understands. Historians still argue over which painters cared most about their frames. Some say it was just a practical matter, keep the painting safe. Others say it was deeply symbolic, because to a Renaissance mind, the frame wasn't just decoration, it was boundary, it was narrative, it was what separated the world inside. The art from yours. You take one last look at the Saint Sebastian painting. Someone has swapped out the cabbage frame for a clean, minimal wood border. The painter sighs. Now he looks like a martyr, not a salad. You smile. Because, of course, it always comes back to the story, the feeling, the message. Even if that message is sometimes hidden behind 12 layers of carved laurel leaves and one very confused-looking cherub. From the hallway, you hear a hush fall. A voice says, Botticelli kept a sealed letter under his desk. Another adds, it was addressed to someone who never existed and signed with a sketch of a sandal. You rise. This next chapter sounds personal. You step into a quiet, sun-dusted room where the air feels heavier than the others, not from dust or varnish, but from something unsaid, forgotten, folded. This is the kind of room where secrets are left beneath floorboards, not whispered. Where hearts are smuggled into paintings, not sonnets, you're here for Botticelli, not the flamboyant Botticelli of the Birth of Venus, with her wind-swept modesty and mythological flair. Not the grand court painter or the Medici's favorite. No. Tonight you meet Botticelli after the parties, after the commissions, after the golden hair and seashells, and sitting quietly at the edge of his desk is a sealed letter. The paper is thick, the wax an unusual blue. There's no name, just a sketch of a sandal in the lower corner. You pause, because of course Botticelli would sign a letter with a shoe. The whispering starts again. Some say the letter was addressed to a woman who didn't exist, a muse made from scraps of memory and fantasy. Others say it was written to Simonetta, Vespucci, the great beauty of Florence, long dead, long mythologized. He painted her dozens of times, sometimes as Venus, sometimes as a Madonna, sometimes as someone slipping out of history with a knowing look. She became his artistic obsession, or maybe his ghost. One story claims Botticelli visited her tomb yearly, left sketches inside her chapel, and once drew her profile from memory, with his eyes closed. You sit in the chair by the desk. The light slants across a collection of small, delicate drawings, sandals, flowing robes, a pair of eyes that look like they remember you from a past life. And then, the letter. Inside, according to rumor, were no words. Just images. A single, folded sheet on which Botticelli had drawn, in the tiniest, softest lines, a sequence of gestures. A hand reaching, a sandal slipping, hair moving in the breeze, a profile turning just before sleep, like a visual poem. No explanation. No caption. Historians still argue what it meant. Some call it a love letter to his lost muse. Others believe it was a meditation on beauty, a farewell to a time when art was driven by longing, not politics. And a few, the more romantic ones, say Botticelli never sent it because he believed the woman he drew wasn't born yet, that she lived in a different time, maybe even yours. You walk to the edge of the room where one of his lesser-known works hangs in a crooked frame. It shows a woman holding a sandal, looking out over a garden that doesn't quite obey the rules of perspective. In the lower corner, scratched faintly into the paint, is a single line. You were never here, but I remember you anyway. You exhale. There's a hush that follows great longing, and this room is full of it. Not grief, not loss. Something gentler, something softer than regret. A brush stroke that trails off because the artist didn't want it to end. As you leave, the light catches the letter once more, glinting off a corner of gold dust. Someone in the hallway murmurs, "Piero's arguing with a compass again. It's about angles. He says 37 degrees might be sacred geometry." Again? You smile. Art may begin with longing, but it always ends with math, eventually. You follow the sound of muttering down a corridor that grows narrower, quieter, more angular, as though the walls themselves are being slowly measured. Here, art is no longer about drama or beauty or gilded frames. Here, it is about geometry, and sitting at the center of this quiet storm is Piero della Francesca, frowning into a spiral drawn in chalk. He hasn't moved in an hour. You watch him from a respectful distance. His robes are dusty, his hands stained with charcoal, and on the table beside him lies an untouched bowl of soup, now cold. There's a diagram scrawled across the tabletop, intersecting arcs, golden ratios, triangles so perfect they seem like prayers. You've walked into the Renaissance's most poetic paradox, the painter who loved logic more than applause. Piero, by all accounts, had the soul of a mathematician and the eyes of a dreamer. He believed beauty wasn't in expression, it was in equation. To him, a saint's face should follow harmonic proportion. A window should mirror the Fibonacci sequence. Our shadow should fall exactly 37 degrees across the floor, no more, no less. Tonight he's stuck on that 37. You hear him whisper, "Is 37 sacred or simply misunderstood?" No one responds, except maybe the compass in his hand, which squeaks. A little in agreement. Historians still marvel at Piero's ability to make paintings feel like living geometry. His flagellation of Christ is famous not for emotion, but for balance, for the way architecture dominates precise, cool, like marble reciting a sonnet. But in person, he was awkward, quiet, shy. One artist once joked that talking to Piero was like talking to a window, clear, beautiful, but never warm, and yet, when he painted, he made silence sing. You glance at a sketch pinned to the wall, 3 robed figures standing in a square courtyard. The light cuts across them diagonally, casting long, crisp shadows. Nothing exaggerated, nothing theatrical, just truth carved from logic. Of course, not everyone appreciated it. A young assistant nearby groans, "I just want to paint clouds. Piero made me measure the ceiling 4 times. Another whispers, "He once corrected my ellipse in a dream." There's a famous story about a bishop who commissioned a portrait. When he saw the final painting, he frowned and said, "It's peaceful." To which Piero responded, "Yes, because it's finished." Critics called his style emotionless, cold, distant. But to Piero, emotion was not in the eyebrows, it was in the angles. His figures look thoughtful, meditative, as if they're waiting for you to solve something hidden in their posture. And maybe they are. You stare at a Madonna he painted, perfectly symmetrical, holding the Christ child like a living compass rose. Her robe folds mirror the lines of the architecture behind her. The child's finger points not to heaven, but to a vanishing point. You smile. It's not warmth you feel. It's clarity. Piero once wrote a treatise on perspective, considered dull at the time. Today, it's foundational. Artists now use terms he coined. Architects still rely on his diagrams. Historians still argue whether he was a painter with the soul of a mathematician, or a mathematician who just happened to have a really good brush hand. And quietly, with no drama, no scandal, no thrown pigment, he changed everything. You glance back once more as Piero redraws the same circle for the 3rd time, now muttering about visual gravity. Someone down the hall chuckles and says, "Meanwhile, everyone in portrait painting is stuck on the hand pose." The what? You know, the weird little half-curled Renaissance hand thing. It's spreading. You raise an eyebrow. That sounds suspiciously like an aesthetic virus. You follow the sound, curious, because nothing ruins a perfectly measured portrait quite like a mysterious claw hand trend. You turn the corner and enter a gallery of faces. They stare at you from the walls. Nobles, merchants, scholars, saints, all beautifully painted, all exquisitely dressed, and all, every single one of them, doing something deeply strange with their hands. You pause in front of one portrait. A duke stands stiffly in velvet robes, his expression stern, eyes sharp, and yet his right hand, half raised, fingers slightly curved, palm facing nowhere in particular, like he's holding a very small, very delicate, imaginary grapefruit. You blink. It's not just him. The next portrait shows a noblewoman, head tilted, thoughtfully, her left hand hovering as though she's about to whisper a secret to a tiny bird that isn't there. The third, a young man with one hand on his hip and the other floating mid-air, fingers elegantly fanned out. The Renaissance, equivalent of Tada. You've just stumbled into one of the strangest, most consistent visual quirks of the period. The open, empty, ambiguously purposeful hand. Some call it the Renaissance claw. Others refer to it as the gesture of implied fruit. One art critic very dramatically named it the posture of eternal offering, whatever the term, as it's everywhere. Even Leonardo was guilty of it. His lady with an ermine? Gorgeous, graceful. And yet that hand, is she petting the ermine or asking it to dance? In Botticelli's Primavera, several of the figures reach out in poses that defy physics and practicality. There's one nymph whose hand is so perfectly posed, it looks like she's pressing an invisible elevator button. Why? No one agrees. Some theories include gesture coding, that each hand meant something specific. Open, just generosity. Raised, susted divinity. Curled cow's contemplation, aesthetic tradition. One artist did it, the next copied. Then everyone did it because no one wanted to look uninformed. Practical modeling issues. Hands are hard to paint, especially when the model has fallen asleep. An ambiguous pose is a safe bet. Symbolism. Maybe the hands reach toward unseen meaning, or maybe the sitter just needed to look like they were about to say something smart. You sit down across from a portrait of a merchant and his wife. He cradles his hand like he's about to serve a muffin. She floats her fingers in the air like she's casting a polite spell. You imagine the painter centuries ago saying, "Could you just hold your hand like you're not sure if it's your hand or not?" Like this. Yes, perfect, don't move for 6 hours. Art historians still debate the origins of this curious trend. Some trace it back to classical sculpture, the Greek and Roman statues with perfectly poised limbs, frozen mid-debate or mid-philosophical sigh. Others think it was simply the result of artists trying to avoid stiff, clenched fists, which often made sitters look like they were about to storm out of their own portrait. Either way, the trend stuck, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. A bishop offering nothing, a scholar presenting air, a princess cupping a ghost's face. Some modern recreations even try to fix the hand, posing modern models in natural gestures. It never looks right, because part of the magic of these portraits is precisely in that. Gentle awkwardness, a suspended moment, a suggestion of meaning that's never explained. You lean back. Somewhere above, a fly buzzes by and lands delicately on the outstretched fingers of a painted woman. For a moment, it looks like she's finally holding something, and then it flies off. Of course, from down the hall, someone chuckles. You think, "That's weird, wait till you see how many animals they started sneaking into the paintings." You mean cats? Cats, dogs, ducks, dragons. Some of them had names. You smile. You're not even surprised anymore. Because of course, after the hands come the creatures. You follow the giggles and quiet pawing sounds to a sun-drenched studio where fur dust hangs in the air like powdered marble, and a soft growl rises from under a bench that may or may not be covered in paw prints. Welcome to the part of the Renaissance they don't tell you about in textbooks, the part where animals began starring in paintings, not just hiding in the corners, not just background detail. No, these creatures were posing. Cats, dogs, falcons, rabbits, parrots, ferrets, even the occasional feral goat with more attitude than most popes. You pause in front of a portrait, a nobleman, regal and brooding, with a tiny dog in his lap, staring directly at the viewer as if it is the true subject. The inscription underneath. Portrait of Lorenzo with his companion, Niccolo, the dog. Of course, the more you look, the more they appear. One Madonna cradles the Christ child in one arm, and what looks suspiciously like a fat tabby in the other. A bishop holds a ferret like a furry scepter. A scholar lounges next to a greyhound in a cape. And the best part? These animals are not random. They're personal. Botticelli supposedly painted the same exact orange cat in 5 different works, always near a corner, always mid-yawn. Scholars now refer to it unofficially as the Muse. Raphael, rumored to have had a pet parrot that mimicked his critics. Titian's dog, a wiry little thing named Biscotto, appears in 3 portraits and 1 religious scene, disguised as the Lamb of God. And Leonardo? Let's just say there's strong evidence he once tried to teach anatomy by sketching the inside of a lizard dressed in dragon wings. Yes, that's a real thing. Yes, he added tiny fake scales. Animals weren't just pets, they were statements. A greyhound? Nobility? A falcon? Power? A monkey? Wealth and a bit of chaotic flair. A bunny? Innocence. A peacock? Pride, naturally. A frog wearing a crown? Possibly allegorical. Possibly just a Tuesday. One painter even insisted on including his turtle in the background of a portrait of St. Jerome. When asked why, he simply said, "He was there." There's something endearing in it all. For all the grandeur, all the theology, all the gold leaf and divine geometry, the Renaissance artists still made room for creatures who chased quills, knocked over jars, and probably ruined more than one nearly finished masterpiece by stepping directly in wet paint. You, Here, two apprentices arguing gently. You can't just put a goat in a scene of the Annunciation. It's not a goat, it's a metaphor. It's eating the lilies, symbolically. A third shrugs and adds, "My master's pig once modelled for St. Anthony." Of course it did. You walk past a painting of a woman seated by a window. In her lap, a cat curled like a comma. On the sill, a pigeon watching her with faint suspicion. Below the table, two dogs mid-snooze. The title, Stillness. You pause, listening to the quiet, rhythmic brushstrokes of a painter nearby. He lifts his brush and calls gently, "Mizio, no, off the canvas." There's a soft meow, then a streak of orange fur disappears out the window, leaving behind one perfect paw print in the corner of a fresco. You smile, and then you hear it. The hall is closing. The masters are silent. Even the dogs have gone to sleep. We think they've finally stopped arguing. You turn toward a final darkened doorway, one more step, one more quiet gallery, because it seems, finally, the Renaissance is ready to rest. You step into the final gallery, a long vaulted room that smells faintly of beeswax, old books, and fading varnish. The torches here are lower, the silence deeper, the arguments, the applause, the hammering of chisels, they've all dissolved into the walls. This is where the Renaissance exhales. The paintings here are subdued, the colors softer. No battles, no saints on fire, no gods tumbling from clouds, just quiet scenes. A woman adjusting her veil, a child looking out a window, a man setting down his brush. You walk slowly. Each step feels like walking on memory. On one side, a forgotten artist's sketch of his own hand, trembling slightly, mid-stroke, mid-thought. On the other, a mural so faded you can only make out the curve of a cheek, the trace of a shoulder, as if the figure is sinking back into the plaster like a dream returning to silence. You reach the end of the room and find nothing, just a wall of pale, untouched lime. But if you sit, just sit, and listen, you can almost hear them. The laughter of apprentices rinsing brushes, the heated debate over a single shade of blue, the whisper of robes as someone leaned in to add the final flick of gold leaf to an angel's wing. They're gone now, of course. Leonardo buried with secrets he never explained. Michelangelo, sour and sublime, carving until his hands refused. Raphael, taken too young, leaving behind a world that suddenly felt too quiet. Titian surviving plague after plague, only to vanish into history one final time. Botticelli folding his love letters into pigment, painting beauty no one asked him to define, and the others, Vasari, Donatello, Piero, Brunelleschi, names, carved into the back halls of genius. Each of them believed in their own way that art could fix the world, or at least hold it still long enough for us to understand something about ourselves. You lean your head against the cool stone. The stories, the colors, the oddities, all of it begins to soften. Even the egos begin to fade into laughter. Even the fierce debates sound now like lullabies. Outside the window, a night breeze stirs the cypress trees. A single note from a distant lute drifts past, too faint to hum along with. Just enough to remind you that beauty, real beauty, doesn't scream, it lingers. You think about the open hands, the impossible reds, the invented machines, the golden domes, the cats, the saints, the sandal-shaped letters. All of it stitched into history, not with perfection, but with passion. And now your breathing slows, the walls blur, the brushstrokes fade into mist, the gallery darkens, and the masters sleep.